Are you involved in a business or thinking about starting one? Do you know there may be environmental impacts from business activities? According to the Environmental Protection Act of 1996, businesses such as gas stations, rice mills, large-scale agriculture and poultry farms, large-scale mining and forestry operations, hotels, and resorts must be authorized. Persons proposing any of these activities need to submit an application for environmental authorization to the EPA.
Hello and welcome to The Environment Matters, a monthly production of the Environmental Protection Agency in Guyana, where we explore the work of the agency in fulfilling its mandate of environmental management and biodiversity conservation. In this month's episode, we'll take a closer look at the EIA process and public participation in environmental management from the agency's standpoint. With me today in studio are two familiar faces to you, if you're a regular viewer of our program. Mrs. Candacie Thompson, she is the head of the communications department at the agency, and Mr. Michael Harding, an environmental officer in the oil and gas unit. Now, before we begin our discussion, just allow me to share a little bit with you regarding the EPA's role when it comes to public participation. Now, the Constitution of Guyana states in Article 25, and I quote, that every citizen has a duty to participate in activities designed to improve the environment and protect the health of our nation, end quote. Further, the Environmental Protection Act, remember we talked about that in February's episode with our legal officer, Mr. Saeed Hamid. That act mandates the EPA. That means that we absolutely have to do this. It mandates us to provide information and education to the public regarding the need for and methods of protecting the environment, improvement of the environment where altered directly or indirectly by human activity, and the benefits of sustainable use of natural resources. The Act also speaks to making information on surveys and other research on natural resources, general information on the state of the environment, all environmental impact assessments, remember we'll be talking about that today, all EIAs conducted, environmental authorizations granted, and other information be made available to the public. The Environmental Protection Agency shall promote the participation of members of the public in the process of integrating environmental concerns in planning for development on a sustainable basis. Great. So now that we're, cooking with gas, we're working with some information. Let's start our discussion on public participation in environmental management with Candacie, who I'm going to ask to tell us about the agency's efforts in this regard. So we'll talk about some of the programs and activities that are conducted by the EPA.
All right, thank you, Rita, and greetings, everyone. As you would have mentioned, public participation is an essential part of the agency's work, and we have a communications department. We have 3 sub-programs under that department: environmental communication, environmental education, and environmental awareness. The aspect of environmental communication, that is where we deal, hands-on with issues affecting persons, give them the opportunity to participate in meetings, scoping meetings, or community meetings, and so on, consultations and things like that. For the environmental education aspect, as the name suggests, that's where we conduct capacity building. We educate persons on pertinent issues. We conduct training and so on, presentations, things like that. For the awareness aspect, we have our various media platforms, and we have publications that we produce, and we channel them, of course, through these various platforms. Because it's essential for decision making. Persons need to be aware. They need to understand the systems that exist, and that will enable them to, fully participate in the process, right? So in addition to that, we have been working, round the clock amidst COVID, of course, adhering to the protocols. But officers are in the field, and their compliance, there's compliance support that is given, where a project may be experiencing some challenges with impacts they may be having on the environment and so on, or on human health. And the officers on the ground, in some cases, may be able to provide support on the spot in terms of recommendations, or they may be able to point them to, where or how they can actually buffer, or reduce or avoid some of those negative impacts. So our program it's robust and it's extensive, and it caters for a wide variety of stakeholders and, of course, the public at large, including our youths and our young people. A part of our program as well is to ensure that persons are aware of major environmental observances that are celebrated globally. And for March alone, we had about 21 activities focused on raising awareness on the environmental observances that were for that month: International Day of Forests, World Wildlife Day, World Water Day, and so on. Right? Understanding the issues, the threats, and more so trying to stimulate positive actions, to bring about that change that is necessary. So we continue to work to educate and to inform the public. We through our platforms as well, we post our public notices for projects, and persons have the opportunity there again to request additional information. And you did mention some of the information that has to be provided to the public and that's available. And once if it's not on our website, and we try, to keep our website updated, but if it's not there and there's specific information that the public may request to better inform them, they can request that information from the agency, and we'll be more than happy to assist, in any way we can.
Yes, of course. And public participation is critical to decision making, because we don't want to give the go-ahead for a project and then we have persons that are affected by that project, and they say, well, I didn't get the chance to air my concerns and what have you. So how then can the public participate in environmental decision making?
All right, so there are several means, and as I mentioned earlier, that we use various channels and platforms to disseminate information. We've had for March alone 19 radio interviews, and our reach is now in all the regions. It's maybe at different times of the day or even during the week, but we're reaching all all 10 administrative regions at this time through our radio programs. As well, we have TV programs and so on. So how can the public participate? Right. One is to be aware of what's happening. We have one of the easiest things to do is to follow our Facebook page, because and our Instagram, of course, and we have our YouTube channel as well, and the website, of course. Keep checking and so on, because once stuff are happening, we put the information out there. So be in the know, and check up on the notices, see what project, where they are. If you need additional information, you can access that from the agency. Usually the project summaries are posted simultaneously with the notices, so that information is available, and the summary will basically give you an idea of the nature and extent of the project, location, proposed design, and so on. So that, as well as meetings, that is extremely important. Participating in scoping meetings, in public disclosure meetings relative to project, even community meetings for projects that may not require an EIA, but they're meetings, sensitization meetings, so that the community could be aware of the nature of the project, and they can, voice their concern at that initial stage, rather than wait until the project is far gone, and then you decide that, you know, I have this concern, right? It may or may not be addressed at that stage, you know, the way you would want it to. So it may be better to voice that concern in advance so that it can be taken into consideration in the decision-making process. So attend once we, you know, meetings are shared and so on. Try your best to attend, and even now, because it's just a click away for the most part. The meetings are virtual, most of them now, given the pandemic. So you just need to click. You don't need to, you know, some people say that they don't make it home on time or whatever.
Get dressed appropriately.
Yes, whatever some of the
stuff.
excuses are. But if the project is of interest, you know, we will find the time to participate. So it's important that we know what is happening, you know, be in the know, and to make it a priority, right? To follow through and to attend those meetings and, you know, hear for yourself what it's about.
All right. So Candace, I just want to stick this in there. You've been working at the agency for quite a while now. How do you find public participation, you know, from the time you started to now heading the communications department?
All right, it has evolved significantly.
Okay.
And I think that evolution came as well with, you know, a lot more sensitization and so on, and the use of technology, which has expanded the reach, and persons are more in the know, and the way in which the information is disseminated too, because sometimes some project might seem complicated to people, and they may not understand from the onset, you know, what it's about and so on. But once that information is disseminated in a simplified format, then that the average person can, you know, read a project summary and they could get the gist of what the project is about, persons are more inclined to participate, as well as, you know, advertising and working with the developers to help them to understand the value of public participation from the onset of the project, right? And, you know, to get that buy-in and so on, and understanding from the public. We have seen an increase in participation. Of course, it has a far way to go still, but what we would like to see a lot more is really active participation, you know, sometimes coming to the meeting from a position of, you know, you would have read and you would have understood, you know, what this project is about. So you want to actively contribute to the decision-making process. So we would like to see a lot more of that, because we've had, you know, many instances where persons came, but they haven't read the project document. So, you know, they're now trying to find out all the details and so on. And while the meetings, especially the scoping meetings, are intended for that purpose, you know, to clarify issues and stuff, it's more for, you know, you come in, you would have read about the project, and you know, you want to learn a bit more. If there are any gray areas that you're not sure about, you know, you ask questions and so on and get clarity there. So it is evolving, and we're happy for those persons who finds it necessary, you know, to participate in the meeting and to share their views and so on project.
Yes, and one of the things that we started to do in sharing the public notices on our social media platforms, because we know that's now one of the fastest and most effective ways to reach persons, is to encourage persons to read the project summaries, you know, before sending their comments and queries to the agency. So we really encourage persons to have, you know, go to our website, have a quick read of the project summary, so that you come with questions rather than having to now have the developer go through the entire project and then there are things that you don't understand. So definitely I'd want to advise those who are tuned in to, you know, be active in your participation. When you see those notices, you can call into the agency, and of course we'll have one of our officers try, you know, their best to answer whatever queries and address whatever comments you have. All right, so let's now go into the EIA process. And start by telling us what exactly is an EIA.
All right, so an EIA or an environmental impact assessment, sometimes the term is used interchangeably with an ESIA. They
Right.
basically both mean the same thing. An ESIA is an environmental and social impact assessment, but for the purpose of the Environmental Protection Act, which speaks to EIA, but in that EIA, the social component is also captured.
Right.
Right? So an EIA is basically a thorough study of the potential impacts the project may have on the environment. So it looks at the direct and indirect impacts. It describes, it identifies those impacts for us to, describe them thoroughly and evaluate them. And an important aspect of the EIA process is the ability to not only evaluate impacts, but to have mitigation measures, right? So you're proposing a project and you want to look at what would be the possible impacts of this project on the environment, on the different environmental parameters and different media, as well as on human health. And so just in case this occurs, how can it be addressed? Or even prior to that, how can you avoid negative or adverse impacts entirely? And if it can't be avoided, because that should be the first stage, right?
Yes,
You
how
try
to avoid the issues
avoid
before they occur.
exactly, rather than try to fix it afterwards. So you avoid it. If you can avoid it, okay, so how can it be reduced? What are the mitigation measures that can be applied to reduce or minimize the negative impacts, right? And there's also offsetting. So in some cases, it cannot be minimized, but it can be offset by some other system. So there are various mitigation measures that will apply for projects, and EIAs are for major projects that would significantly or may significantly impact the environment, or even projects where the impacts may be unknown.
Yes, so that was actually going to lead me to my next question, which is give us some examples, or can you share some examples of projects that would require an EIA?
All right, so like large-scale forestry operations, for example, mining, hydro, electricity, wind power, building of construction of certain of roads and so on. So major establishment or developmental activities, I should say, may require an environmental impact assessment. But what is important to note is that that is done through a screening process in terms of determining what requires an environmental impact assessment versus what does not. During the process of screening, based on the tool that is used and how the project is actually evaluated, and then the agency can make a decision based on certain parameters and the potential impacts and so on, the scale of it. There are different factors that are considered. The agency makes a determination on whether or not an EIA is required.
All right, so kind of jumped the gun a bit because we want to talk a bit later. But it was bound to come up, when talking about the EIA. So who conducts this EIA?
All right, so in accordance with the Act, and contrary to what some persons may think, it's not conducted by the EPA. The Act requires that the EIA be conducted by independent consultant. However, they should be approved by the EPA. So as the developer would have their independent consultant, they would submit the list of persons to the agency, that their desire to conduct the EIA, and the agency now has to go through those consultants to ensure that they have the necessary competency to complete the work required under the EIA, and the agency will have to approve or reject the consultants based on the project and their skill set and based on them meeting the requirements for that specific project EIA.
Right, indeed. All right, so aside from fulfilling, what the requirement that is in the Environmental Protection Act for certain projects, of course, why is conducting an EIA necessary?
An EIA, it's important because for the Environmental Protection Agency as a decision maker, that's an important tool for decision making. It will help us to really understand the project in terms of the nature of the impacts, and to have systems in place in the permit condition when the project is permitted to monitor those impacts and ensure that the developer remains in compliance. So it's very important for us to know what the conditions are, under which the project is being implemented, and how it would affect the various media and how it will affect the people around. So EIAs also capture cultural heritage. It also looks at archaeological stuff. So it's very thorough. It's not just about the environment and the air, the water, land, and so on.
It's also about the people.
It's also about the people and the heritage and so on, and culture, the impact that it will possibly have on culture and so on.
All right. So you did mention in your remarks the screening tool, and we did discuss the screening tool that was revised, right, in the very first episode for 2021. And of course, the EIA process all starts with the submission of that application by the developer, and then we screen it at the agency. So after it's screened and determined that this project requires an EIA, what are the next steps?
All right. What I need to mention as well about the screening tool is that the screening tool was updated to have in a more numerical way, so that we can reduce subjectivity in terms of assessing the project and determining whether or not it requires an EIA. So there are numerical values to the tool. So you would know automatically if it comes out between what the specific value, where it falls. And it also helps us, to gauge what else is required. So even though the project may not require an EIA, there may be other stuff that needs to be done based on the risk and based on the potential impact. So a risk assessment, for example, or they might need to have an environmental management plan, right? So just to mention that.
Okay.
So to go back to your question, after the project has been screened and the agency decides that an EIA is required, the developer is the person who submits the application for environmental authorization. So they're informed of the agency's decision, and we await their acceptance of whether or not they will proceed with the project as an EIA project. Because we've had cases where some persons may no longer want to proceed with the project, or they may want to scale it down, or things like that. So we inform them of the agency's decision. So once we're okay, once they accept that they're going to go ahead with the project has to go on a 28 days public notice, right? And that is to give the public the opportunity to review the project summary or any other documents that they may deem necessary, and to submit comments or recommendations to the agency in terms of what should be captured in that EIA study, right? And what we do as well is to work with the developer to ensure that the public participation, it's a lot more extensive. So not just us, not just publishing the notice and waiting on submission. but conducting scoping meetings, and that is useful for the developer as well, because in that scoping meeting you get a lot of useful information that you may not have gotten even in the feasibility study for the project.
Right.
So what they would do, and we recommend that that be done simultaneously during the 28 days period when the notice is published. So that allows them to interact with the stakeholders in the communities within the project area of influence, so that persons can understand the project and they can make their contributions as well in terms of what are some of the things that they would like to see captured in the EIA. What are some of their concerns or recommendations, right? So that is an opportunity for persons to, apart from reading this stuff, to fully be on the ground, or in this case virtually for now,
Yes.
to understand the project in more details and to say what they would like to see. And it's also important even for the developer, because they may be able, from the scoping meeting, to identify skill sets that they may need in the project, or
Yes,
even
that
in
they
the
can
EIA.
find right in the community.
Exactly. As well as even alternatives, because that's an important component of the EIA report, that you need to look at alternatives. So not only alternatives in terms of location, but it may be designed for the project. You have a proposed project, and you have a preliminary design, you have a preliminary location and all of that. But during the scoping process, or even during the conduct of the EIA itself, they may be able to identify some other areas and some other things that weren't considered right initially, and it would help the project, so they may be able to make those adjustments as they go along.
Yes, and I know this part of the EIA process is critical, because we want to avoid conflicts down the line when the project is actually operational.
Exactly. So it's better to deal with stuff in the initial stage, right? Rather than try to fix it later down. And we really admonish the developers as well to understand the value of that, public participation from the onset. Early start, you start engaging people, even though it calls for planning and it calls for money and stuff like that. But in the long run and the long term, right, it would pay off for them. So it's important to do that early, investment, and ensure that persons understand what the project is about, their role, and you get that buy-in, basically.
Yes, so audience, I do encourage you, when you see the public notices in the newspapers, take note of the date. Even if it's not an EIA project and it's one of the projects that's placed on the 30 days public notice, please ensure that you go to our website, or you can come into our offices, request a copy of that project summary, read, be informed, come with your questions, your comments, to ensure that we avoid issues down the line in the process. So the 28 days is up. What's the next step?
What happens next?
Yes.
All right. So when the 28 days after that period would have expired, the next step is to move to basically finalize the terms and scope of the project. Some persons refer to it as the terms of reference, but the Act refers to it as the terms and scope.
Okay.
So
yes.
I'll
so we
use
definitely
what the Act,
have to go by what the Act
has,
says.
right? So based on the comments that you would have received from the public, from various sectors and so on, because even during that scoping process outside of the public, if it's a project that is relevant to a specific sector or sectors, we would also ensure that those representatives are there at those meetings as well. So when we would have received comments from the public, from the respective sectors, and so we use those to coin the terms and scope for the project, right? In collaboration with the developer and their consultant, right? So we develop the terms and scope, and once that is finalized, that is basically their roadmap for the EIA study. So they use that as a guide, and they can proceed to conduct the EIA study.
All right. So we have the public notice being published, the time has expired, we get comments, sometimes we don't get comments. The terms of reference is developed, the EIA study is conducted, and after that, the report is submitted to the agency. What happens after then?
Just before I go to what happens after then,
Yes.
I just want to inject for the actual EIA study. The act does require consultation, right, with relevant stakeholders as organizations, groups, and so on. So outside of that, scoping that will help you to understand what are the general issues that maybe that needs to be taken into consideration. There is also in the process itself that consultations need to be done now, more targeted consultations that is depending on the project, maybe with specific groups, it may be with individuals, it may be with communities, it may be with NGOs,
Right.
government agencies. So that consultation is usually informed by a stakeholder consultation plan, right? So you need to, even before you start the consultation, during the EIA, is to identify who the stakeholders are, the main stakeholders, that is the interest group, basically, and the persons who may be adversely affected, right? Who are those people that, you need to consult with more in detail to get feedback from them. And in addition to identifying them, how would you consult with them? So what are the most appropriate means of reaching this particular target audience, right? And an important part of that process is consultations, especially for projects in the hinterland with indigenous communities. I need to understand the indigenous culture and how to properly engage indigenous communities. So that is essential, right? So outside of the scoping and all of that, in the conduct of the EIA, they need to have a stakeholder consultation plan, which clearly identifies the stakeholders and how, when, and where they're going to meet with these different categories of people or groups or even individuals, right? So now we are at the stage where the EPA received the draft report.
Yes.
So once the draft report has been submitted, the agency, of course, will acknowledge receipt of it, and the review period would start. But what I want to mention is that for EIA projects, there is an independent board, the Environmental Assessment Board, or referred to as the EAB. That's a group of specialists that assist the agency with reviewing environmental impact assessments, and then they would make recommendations to the agency on whether it's accepted or not, or some of the areas that needs to be addressed if there are gaps and so on. So when the report is received, we commence the process for review. That is internal review within the agency, review by the EAB, as well as external review, right? So with the external review now, the project goes on a 60-day public notice, right? So we inform the public that the agency would have received the EIA, the draft EIA for the specific project, and it's now available for comments, review by the public. And when that notice goes out, the EIA simultaneously is published on the agency's website, right? And what we also do is to work with the developers to have EIAs as well as project summaries, even before the scoping, to be placed at strategic location in the project area of influence so that persons can easily access these resources, right? So we have the EIAs, so NDCs, for example, or libraries, easily accessible, public spaces. So we have them place the EIAs in these locations, and we notify the public that it's available for review. So while we begin our internal review, and the EAB is having their review, the public as well during that time, what we also do is to work with the developer to have public disclosure meetings.
Right.
So pre-EIA, we had the scoping where, you know, the persons are sensitized, and so the EIA, the draft is submitted, and we have the disclosure. Where, because we know these are, for those who have seen EIA, sometimes they could be, you know, they're very large documents and so on.
Voluminous.
Yes. So what happens during that disclosure is that, again, the communities of influence are sensitized of the main findings of the EIA. So these are the major impacts. These are the alternatives we look at for the impact, the adverse impact. These are how we intend to mitigate it. These are some of the benefits that can be derived from the project. So they get to understand basically a summary of what the EIA would have found based on the study and the evaluation and so on. So during that time as well, they have the opportunity to, you know, to share whether they are satisfied with how some of the potential impacts would be mitigated, or they have other concerns, or there are some gaps, and what they would do is to submit those comments to the agency. At that time as well, the relevant sectors for the project, they're also reviewing, and they also submit comments and recommendations and so on to the agency. So what the agency would do is to take all those comments, suggestions, recommendations from the various groups and the EAB, and we analyze them, and then we make an informed decision on whether or not the EIA is accepted and we should proceed to issue environmental permit, or whether or not the EIA is not accepted entirely, you know, and it needs to be redone, or whether the EIA is accepted conditionally and there's probably some gaps or some areas that needs to be addressed before it is fully accepted. So those are the approaches that we take after the report has been submitted.
All right. So from that, I think we would have garnered that when we talk about public participation, it's not just, you know, members of the general public. There's also persons who are involved in specific sectors, the NGOs, and the list goes on with the specific stakeholder groups.
Correct.
So it's a very rigorous process, and at the end of the EIA process, we know that due diligence has been done.
Correct.
So we can trust that when the EPA grants this permit, that it's done so from a very informed place.
And scientifically informed position. Correct.
All right, so we'll take an ad break now, and stay tuned with us and join us in the second half of our show. You're watching The Environment Matters.
Gosh, morning, Miss Cheryl. I'm late for work.
I noticed the other day y'all had a big campaign with them police officers, so shutting down them people barbecue, wedding, dance. Man, how y'all expect these people to make money and survive?
Oh, Miss Cheryl, that is far from the truth. The EPA and the Guyana Police Force are actually working together to ensure that persons who conduct certain businesses and activities are authorized. We've tried to allow them to adhere to the noise regulations.
Well, there's gonna be a new law. What law is this?
These laws were always in place. It's now that we're getting all these complaints at the agency, we are trying to enforce them. The Environmental Protection Act has been in place since 1996, and it states that persons and businesses must apply for environmental authorization before operating a sound-making device.
Well, girl, I never know this thing is prior to the law.
So if you're keeping a barbecue or an open-air function, like a wedding or a concert, especially in your community, right, and you're playing a music system, you have to apply for a short-term noise permit. And for persons that operate in a business and you got generators and stuff, you have to apply for a long-term permit. And that is applicable to bars and hotspots and clubs also.
Well, now that you explain it, I understand it. It's unfair to the elderly, sick people, and even them little children.
That is correct. According to the World Health Organization, loud noise can cause stress, sleep deprivation, and hearing impairment, and I'm sure you wouldn't want that.
Oh, now I understand. Thank you for explaining it, Miss Sonia.
For more information, you can contact the EPA at 225-5471 or visit our office at Ganji Street, North Sophia, Georgetown.
Welcome back to The Environment Matters. Thank you for staying with us. Joining me in studio are Mrs. Candacie Thompson, and she was with us for the first half of our discussion on public participation in environmental management, and we were talking about environmental impact assessments and why it's necessary for the public to participate in this process. Also in studio today is Mr. Michael Harding. He is an environmental officer in the oil and gas unit, and he's going to talk a bit later on about guidelines that were developed for the sector that he's working in. All right, so Candacie, let's continue our discussion on the EIA process by focusing on guidelines that were revised or developed for various sectors. So we'll start by talking about why were these guidelines revised? What are the guidelines and why were they revised?
All right, thank you again, Arita. So the guidelines that were developed for the EIA, various sectors that would require EIA projects, why were they developed? The guidelines that we revised were done in 2004.
Okay, wow.
So I think the reason may be obvious, but of course the landscape has changed since then. The economic landscape, the social landscape, environmentally as well, technology, physical dynamics and so on would have changed. Hence the need to revise and update those guidelines so that they can remain relevant to what is happening in our country.
All right, and what specific sectors were captured in the revision?
All right, I should mention as well that the development of the guideline, it was a collaboration with support basically from WWF, World Wildlife Fund Guyana office, as well as the Netherlands Commission for Environmental Assessment. They provided technical support for the development. So it was actually developed by a consultant, of course, in collaboration with the agency and various sectors, right? So in terms of why the sector, so we have a generic rules and procedure guidelines that focuses basically on the sectors that were not specific, that were not captured specifically, but any other sector that requires EIA, they can refer to the generic guidelines for guidance, basically, because that's what the guidelines provide. Okay. And there are seven annexes, basically. So there's a generic one, and there are specific sector guidelines for hydropower, for thermal energy, for electricity transmission, for mining, for forestry. Those were the ones that were amended or updated. And the new guideline that was produced under that same arrangement was the guidelines for the oil and gas sector.
All right, so we'll talk about that in just 1 minute, Michael. So will these guidelines be available for the public to access, and how can they access those guidelines?
So the guidelines, the electronic version, of course, they're already on our website. The public can access those. We would have printed limited copies, and of course the sectors that they refer to would have first priority in terms of distribution of those hard copies, but other persons who may require them can access them online.
All right, so Michael, oil and gas, it's on the lips of every Guyanese. As we are now an oil-producing nation. And so let's talk about the development of the oil and gas guidelines. Firstly, when did this happen?
Well, the guidelines itself, we didn't get like a head start as compared to the others, such as mining and thermal. It would have started around August and ended in October of last year. It was due to the fact that we were running the system and there was a draft guideline developed in 2017. This is a very big sector and a new sector that, as you said, everyone keeps speaking about. So why not? They quickly secured an amazing consultant who has more than 26 years experience within the industry itself. And she was very integral and she communicated a lot with us. And we were able to execute this project in such a short timeline.
All right, so you mentioned WWF, Netherlands Commission, correct?
Yeah.
And that consultant. So aside from the EPA and those mentioned, which other stakeholders were involved in the development of the guidelines?
It'll be easy to group them. I would just say we had a lot of governmental and NGO-based stakeholders. As we would notice, NGOs have been giving a lot of contribution when it comes to the review of the EIAs and projects. They're very cognizant as to what is going on. And given that their agencies, their commitment to environmental protection also, we decided let's bring them into. They know what is going on. They know about a lot of projects and grants that they have within their organizations. And we're trying to find like a more collaborative approach as to not waste resources, but also pull from persons who are extremely technically competent within their field as to create a document to help not only the EPA, but the country itself.
Yes, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. You know, it's not just about the work of the agency, but it's also about what's in the country's best interest, right? And, you know, of course, we must thank you for being proactive in identifying the need for these guidelines and having them done not only rigorously, but also in a very timely manner. All right, so let's talk about the main parts of the guidelines. The public should be fully aware of every single thing that's within them, but you know, for the purpose of the show, let's talk about the main parts. What does the public need to know at this point?
I think the first thing the public should know is why exactly did we go about these developing or revamping this guideline. Oil and gas is a very fast-paced industry. There are a lot of non-profit organizations around the world who keep updating and upgrading their so-called guidelines and we call it globally, we call it best practices, industry best practices. So with that being said, between 2017 to 2020, when we completed the guideline, there were a lot of new documents in there. So the aim of the guideline itself was to create like a map where not only would the developers and the general public know what should be contained within an EIA document, but it also helps the EPA in reviewing the document, because this guideline just sets a basis for, let's just say, the needs. These must be in an EIA.
Okay.
We completely understood that everything is also dependent on the terms and scope, and in no way is the guideline absolute, but these are just like the needs. And from there, as each project is different environments, you move along from there. But these are just, as I said before, the needs itself. And with that being said, the guideline focuses primarily on the upstream portion. Within oil and gas, there are 3 different tiers. We call them upstream, midstream, downstream. With upstream dealing with exploration activities and the production itself to this up to the surface. There is the transportation and processing, that is what we call the midstream. And the downstream itself would be the marketing and sales of these oil products. So we primarily wanted to focus on the upstream, as that is the stage that we're in right now. I mean, we're also more or less branched into the midstream a little bit with the transport of crude itself, which we would be giving, which we do give authorization for, because there's just a high level of environmental risk that's associated with the transport of crude. But yeah, it's just the upstream. So the guideline would focus on the various, how do I say this? As I said, we broke them up into 3 tiers, but within that too, you also have various activities, exploration activities such as seismic surveys, exploration drilling, appraisal drilling. Then there are developmental activities such as the production itself and bringing up to the FPSO. It covers all of those aspects in such a way that it's not too prescriptive, as you don't want to tell them you have to do X, Y, Z to the T, but you guide them along that along that path, because at the end of the day, it's still a discussion and there's still the terms and scope. But something very big within this guideline too is the agency's push for the cradle to grave assessment, where we aim to have a better understanding of all the waste being generated, but not only how it's being generated. How are you managing this waste? What are you doing from point of generation to final point of disposal? So that is something very big within the guideline. But what the consultant did too, which I would have deemed as going above and beyond, is that she gave a lot of feedback from the initial TOR stage. And though we were looking at a lot of international standards, guidelines, and roadmaps, we had discussions, and we were very cognizant as to the local legislation that exists, whether it be policies or acts. And we try to funnel that into the guideline itself too, but in a way that should these acts and legislation be amended, it will be covered within the guideline itself. And also stuff like the Petroleum Commission Bill too, we try to capture as much as possible. And we did get a lot of help and support from the governmental agencies and the NGOs in doing this, because everybody was able to did we miss this act? Did we miss this portion? This is something that we're working on. This is currently in Parliament or Cabinet. So I would like to just extend a great deal of thanks to everyone who supported, because they were cognizant of this very short timeline, but they were very dedicated and committed to doing this because they knew this is something that will benefit all of us.
All right. So you talked about the stakeholders that were involved in very generic terms.
Yeah,
so
sorry.
I want you to name names now. So who were some of the stakeholders that were involved, the government agencies, the NGOs, in the development of these guidelines?
I'd like to apologize beforehand if I miss anyone, but there was the Guyana Marine Conservation Society, there was WWF, Conservation International, there were various ministries such as the Ministry of Agriculture, more specifically Fisheries Department, there was MARAD, CDC, we also had input from Foreign Affairs also. There was the then Office of Climate Change and then Department of Environment. We had the Guyana Wildlife Commission. They were just a lot. They had a lot more. So I'm sorry if I can't name everything off my mind right now.
All right. So I'm sure the Ministry of Natural Resources, of course.
Yes, they were also part of it. Sorry about that.
Yes, and you did apologize beforehand. And for those of you who don't know what some of those acronyms mean, let's start our public participation journey by going and doing some research to find out what some of those acronyms Michael mentioned were, right? All right. So is there anything else that we need to know about these guidelines?
From the oil and gas perspective, as I would have said, it is just a guideline. By no way is it law. It's just to help not only our review, but the public to know what is in there, and for the developers or / operators to know what we'll be looking for. Also, persons need to understand that every project is completely different. So the main thing we need to focus on is developing a very strong terms and scope to make sure that we capture as much as we can. I know right now within the agency, as we get a lot of persons commenting on the EIA document itself, and we make note of this because as we continuously develop terms of scope and move forward, we try not to repeat, I won't say mistakes, but they review them as learning lessons. A lot of persons, as Ms. Thompson would have said before, they know what is going on. They're well read. So we're able to learn things from persons in the public, as some small comments that you may think might not add value at the time, they really do when you look at the broader picture, because a lot of persons within country really do care about the environment and the development of the sector. So it's just that it's a guideline and it should not be stagnant as stuff continuously upgrade and new documents come out. We should be upgrading also. We shouldn't stick here and be like, this is it, we can use this for 20 years. No, we have to keep being at the top of our game. Oil and gas is not waiting for anybody. So we should keep pushing.
Indeed, we should. All right, so this is bringing us to the end of our program. Now, I'd like to invite you both to share any parting words of advice, encouragement to those who are tuned into our program. So, Michael, as you were just speaking, we'll start with you.
I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in to today's segment. But as I would have said many times before, just continuously keep reading and sending in your comments, reviewing our documents. We really do care about your input and we really do value it because, as I said, there's so much that we can learn from you and you from us. So I view it as a collaborative approach. Persons within country are now uniting to build a better Guyana by understanding what we have, where we want to go, and the steps involved in getting there.
All right, thank you, Arita. I would just want to remind persons that your participation is integral to the process of environmental management and the work of the EPA. You know, and do stay in contact with us. We always like to hear from you, and we are always happy to be of service to the public. So until next time, stay connected.
All right. And with that, we come to the end of our program. Remember to keep updated with the work of the EPA by following us on social media. Like us on Facebook and Instagram. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have a lot of new content on that platform. Remember to pick up a copy of the Sunday Chronicle or the Guyana Times, or you can pick up both if you have that spare change available, to read our weekly column. Tune into our bi-weekly radio interviews. We're also on Guyana Today. And of course, we encourage you to visit the EPA's website, www.epaguyana.org, to also keep updated with what we're doing at the EPA and to view those new and updated guidelines. So you see there's a lot of room for you to be involved with environmental management and biodiversity conservation in Guyana and around the world. Stay safe. Again, I echo the sentiments of my colleagues. Remember to wear your mask, sanitize, distance as you should. Just follow all the guidelines that are laid out by the authorities. Remember to respect each other and the environment. Thank you for joining us.
At the Environmental Protection Agency, we believe that the environment is everybody's business. We can start caring for our planet by becoming more environmentally friendly in our everyday actions. Here's what you can do. Dispose of waste in a garbage bin. Clean our drains, yards, and carpets regularly. Take a reusable shopping bag to the market. Support local butchers and farmers to reduce packaged waste. Plant a kitchen garden, trees, and flowers. Compost your organic waste. Conserve water and electricity. Carry a reusable water bottle. These little acts are good for your health and that of the environment. Remember, Healthy people work better and achieve more, and together, small actions make a big difference. For further information on how you can help, please contact the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, Ganges Street, Sophia, or telephone us at 225-5467. You can also visit our website, epaghana.org, or our Facebook and Instagram page.